So good morning and welcome to those of you who are joining us on the island, off the island. It's still a very beautiful morning here. Yesterday we looked at the meaning of the Easter story and concluded that to understand the meaning of the story we have to connect it to our own meaning, because meaning is about connection. It's when we feel connected to other people, of course to ourselves and to the cosmos, that we can live with meaning and make meaning out of even what seemed at the time to be meaningless or destructive experiences. That's why we often look back to difficult periods in our lives, and it's only with perspective and with the hard work of reconnection that we can see the meaning of them and even feel gratitude for what once caused us great suffering. Suffering, as I said, is part of the story. It's part of our own story, part of our own lives. As the Buddha said, life is full of suffering, so we can't deny it, evade it. The pursuit of pleasure or distraction in order to run away from the inevitable or necessary suffering in our lives, in fact, only increases our suffering. So these are hard-won lessons. If we can be trained from an early age to learn how to understand and accept suffering, that we don't, for example, always get what we want in the instant we want it, and we learn not to throw a tantrum if we have delayed gratification, then we're better off. We're obviously trained to be able to deal with the bigger disappointments or challenges of life. If we're not, and this is part of the problem of our culture, of instant gratification, consumerism, then suffering seems something alien and something that shouldn't be. It's meaningless, in fact. Whereas, in fact, suffering is one of those elements of life. It's not the only element, fortunately, but it is one of the elements of life which can teach us how to reconnect, how to see life actually as a deeper and deeper discovery or regaining of wholeness, which is reconnection. And then we looked at the great Christian insight that is born out of this story of Easter and the story of the suffering and the death of Jesus, when it is viewed in the light of the resurrection, because we only see the story of Jesus in the light of the resurrection, in fact. What we then looked at was the great Christian insight that this meaning of the gospel story of Easter, in fact, is a key. It's a key that takes us into the full meaning, the ultimate meaning of life, existence, the cosmos. And in human terms, this was expressed very early in Christian history as the destiny that we all have to be divinized, to be, in a sense, turned into God, or at least to, not to be God, but to become God through a full participation in the being of God. St. Peter says this in the first letter, that we are called to share in the very being of God. And this is a founding insight of Christian faith and of the Christian approach to life. This is our meaning, ultimately. And we see suffering, just as we see joy, in this perspective. So let's go a little further. And then I said, well, how can we make sense of this destiny of divinization through a story which shows us that Jesus, the God-man, as we understand him, is in this pretty messy situation where if we see Jesus as a translation, a perfect translation, a complete translation of the divine into the human language, and that there's no slippage, there's no mistranslation anywhere, that what Jesus says and does in a perfectly human way is in fact an expression of the divine, then what sense does it make, does it have to say that we see this divinization within the suffering and the death of Jesus? And as we saw, suffering is related to the whole person, and the whole person is in a sense deconstructed or brought to the point of extinction almost in real affliction or suffering. So let's go a little further into some of those ideas, and it's worth struggling with them, although at first they may not make any sense because this isn't the language we were taught to understand the meaning with. We have a different image of God, and perhaps we were even brought up to suspect, like some of the early heretics in the early church who struggled with this question just as we do, that really Jesus didn't really suffer because he was God, and so he just looked as if he was suffering, and it was good for us to see it, but he couldn't really have experienced it as we experience it. So by exploring this, even though at first it seems to make no sense, we will find that we come to certain breakthroughs in understanding where our faith expands and deepens and clarifies and matures, and we begin to see not only the meaning of the story, but the meaning of our own story and the meaning of the story of the cosmos, in fact, in a different way, a different light. When you find that a group or a community or a family is not working well, there are certain signs of that. Breakdown of communication, conflicts that aren't resolved, that are just pushed under the carpet, a lack of transparency, a lack of trust. And when we see this happening in a family, in a community, in a workforce, we will inevitably see some dysfunction. We'll see that the capacity to forgive is not working, that people are refusing to forgive, unable to forgive. So we see these symptoms, and of course we naturally look for a cause. What's at the root of this? Because human beings, whether in a family or in a workforce or a community, can live differently together. They can interact, deal with their conflicts, deal with their differences through forgiveness, through transparency, through honesty. What is wrong here? What's going wrong? Where have the relationships broken down? And inevitably we find a division. Somewhere there is a flaw, a crack in the group, in the body of relationships. Things run well when there is unity. Unity, of course, in human affairs needs to be constantly nurtured because life is full of problems, misunderstandings, little betrayals, mistakes, bad moods, and the unity that we seek and need and love when it's there needs to be cared for. It's not just achieved once and for all. It's something alive, and we need to keep it alive. And this unity is really what we mean by wholeness. Wholeness is not the same as perfection. One of the problems in all human relationships at all levels is perfectionism. We have perhaps an image of what would be a perfect marriage, or a perfect environment to work in, or a perfect community. And when we see imperfections, we see people not stepping up to that mark, or we see people or groups operating in an imperfect way, we get depressed or we get angry and we feel there's a failure. But actually, we don't need to feel that. We can accept imperfection as part of wholeness. This is a fundamental insight of the Christian moral vision, that sin, imperfection, is part of our journey. Sin is behovely, as we saw yesterday. Sin is necessary even, as we'll sing on Saturday evening. Oh, happy fault of Adam. The wholeness is big enough to include and deal with sin, imperfection. And in the same way, our way of living with other people should be whole enough to be able to deal with our imperfections, our own and other people's, of course. Only God is perfect. We don't have to bother about being perfect. What we do have to bother about is being open to this mystery. That means something we can't fully understand, but we can experience. This mystery of wholeness, which contains within it healing powers. The power to reconnect, to forgive, to learn from mistakes. When we are in touch with this mysterious wholeness, which is present in us, in our hearts, in the center of our being, and present within potentially present within every family, within every community, within every group of people, this wholeness is there as a presence, as a force, as a grace. Then the problems of life, the imperfections of relationships, and the sicknesses of the soul can be healed. And the discovery of our failures, our imperfections, our sins, should at the same time be a deeper awareness. Of course, we're not pleased to discover that we're imperfect, or we've made mistakes, or we've done something we're ashamed of. We're not happy about that. But at the same time that we discover it, we should simultaneously realize that at a deeper and fuller level, that wholeness is present to us. This is, again, the simple Christian understanding of grace and sin. Where sin is, grace abounds all the more. God does not punish. It's the ego that punishes. We punish ourselves. Sin contains its own suffering and punishment. God doesn't need to punish us for our sins. That's why that metaphor of redemption we looked at yesterday, which is one of the several ways that we can explain the cross, is one that we have to treat very carefully. That God is demanding some punishment inflicted upon Jesus in order to forgive and reconnect and make us whole. To heal, you have to get to the root of a problem, to dig down deeper than the cause of the sickness. And that's why we can't remain on the surface of things, and why we can't deal with recurrent problems in relationships or in the world just by fixing things on the surface, band-aid solutions, or platitudes, or short-term solutions. The human psyche is full of these imperfections and full of these wounds, and so it cries out for healing. As part of our nature, we seek wholeness. We seek peace, health, harmony, well-being is the modern word for it. And the religious view of humanity, which has been present from earliest times, has unanimously, but in different ways, recognized that there is a deep wound or deep disconnection within the world, within the psyche, and that it is more than an individual problem. It's a primal problem. This insight into what we in the Christian theology came to call original sin was often associated with the myths of creation. You see that in any anthropological survey. It's some sense of a falling away or of a division somewhere in time or out of time or in a mythical time that is impacted upon the way we live and interact today as well. And it's this that we find in the biblical myth, in our Genesis story of the fall. And that's why we retell this story as part of the Easter story. Perhaps it's better for us to see the fall of Adam as this disconnection in some way, as we came to understand it as a disconnection that was necessary in order to achieve a higher connection, perhaps in the same way that children have to disconnect from their parents in order to be able to reconnect, to form relationships of their own and later, we hope, back with their parents. But the first sin, which comes as a consequence of this disconnection, is probably in the biblical story the sin of Cain, the act of violence that he and we often choose to make. The act of violence, whether it's a word or a deed, that flows out of our feeling of disconnection, our jealousy, as in the case of, and sadness, as in the case of Cain, who believed that his sibling was getting more of God's love than he was. Out of that sadness and anger that Cain felt arose the first sin, the first act of violence, of actual hostility towards another person. You know, we can be hurt, we can be betrayed, we can feel deep suffering from a breakdown of the imperfections of our relationships. But it's another step when we become vengeful, violent, and we try to hurt the person who has hurt us. We had a baptism here on the island on Sunday, and in this simple ritual that gathers a family and friends from many different places and with many different levels of faith or understanding, it's one of those beautiful rituals or sacraments that has a deep and complex meaning. But one of its meanings that I think touches us in a way that's difficult to describe or rationalize is the sense or the idea of some kind of primal karma or primal division, original sin, being healed through grace. Now that's we fight, we kind of react against that because we say, how can this beautiful little innocent baby be full of sin? And yet, everybody there senses, I think, that this is the meaning of the symbol, not just for the child, but for the family around it, that there is the possibility of healing, of reconnection at source from the very beginning, that we are all born into this broken world. We all grow up and discover inevitably, however protective our parents may be, we will inevitably discover betrayal and failure. We see our parents fighting, or we see families break up, or we see betrayal of friendships, disappointments. So inevitably we're going to grow up and recognize this quality of brokenness in our world. And so from the very source in this sacrament, we say, okay, that's going to happen. Even for this innocent child, we are all going to experience it. Suffering, old age, sickness and death. But there is a grace too. There is a grace present within this brokenness, a grace of wholeness, a grace of healing. And the child, or the infant, or the adult being baptized is introduced and connected to a source of wholeness in the body of Christ, in the body of the church, the mystical body of the church, and in a very incarnate way through the family. If I do a baptism, I tell the people who are making the promises, don't make them, just maybe a little bit illicit, but there's no point in making promises unless you believe in them. So just mumble otherwise. And you'll be more honest, and that honesty will be a greater gift to the child. And I hope it puts us all back into touch with the real meaning, the freedom and the meaning that's contained in the symbolic ritual. But what is happening is that the child, and with the child, the family and the friends gathered there, waiting to go down to the pub for celebration, are actually being exposed for a moment to the awareness of this grace that begins to heal and continues to be a source of strength and wholeness through life. Because the idea of this baptism, and baptism is an important sacrament for Easter. Through this sacrament, we experience a grace that comes to us through the symbol, and the symbol stays with us because it's part of our story now. We've actually done something. We've actually been baptized or baptized the child. So it's a fact. Even God can't make something not happen when it has happened. So it's a fact, and because it's a fact, it continues to be a source of grace. We're all still touched by the grace of baptism. Maybe it hits you, in your 20s, 30s, or much later in life. So we are healed, and we see this in the sacrament of baptism, which is symbolically, remember, one of its meanings is a sign of our dying and rising with Christ. Again, difficult to rationalize when you're standing around with a crying baby in a church, but that's the mystical meaning of it. And we are healed by being reconnected to the great wholeness which is God. As I said, redemption is one metaphor for explaining this reconnection, but perhaps a more powerful metaphor for us today is one of healing. Jesus as the divine physician. Jesus who came not to judge, but to heal those who were sick. We can see the consequences of this primal fault, this original sin, wherever we look. Just look through the newspaper. Look at what's going on in your own families or maybe your own heart. We can see the consequences, but not the fault itself. This is something Mother Julian of Norwich said, one of the great theologians of the Church. In this little book she wrote, The Revelations of Divine Love. She said she looked around the world and saw everywhere she looked signs of this division, signs of sin. But when she looked for sin itself, she couldn't see it. Because it doesn't exist. It doesn't have a reality. But there are things that don't have reality that can still impact upon you. For example, most of all, an illusion. Imagine you were paranoid and you were absolutely convinced that the CIA were tapping your phone and hacking your emails and following you down the street. And as a result of that, you bought a gun to protect yourself, and when you saw somebody you thought was a CIA agent and you turned and shot them in the street, well, that's a consequence, a very real consequence of something that is completely unreal, completely untrue. So unreality has a force. It is a force to be reckoned with. It's a force that expends itself, that exhausts itself eventually. But while it's operating, it has a sort of momentum that it has gained from reality, but is cut off from reality. But while it's there, it can do a lot of damage. It can create wars and genocide and so on, or break relationships. So Mother Julian sees that this sin, that the consequences of which are everywhere, in itself doesn't exist. One of the symptoms of this primal fault, which has to be healed, bound up, treated with loving care, one of the symptoms is the internal contradictions that we are all aware of in ourselves to varying degrees and in different circumstances. For example, just to bring it back to meditation, think of the attitude you have, the contradictory attitude you may have, most people have, at times anyway, to meditation. You may be attracted to meditation because you know and you feel that this will be good for you, that it is right for you, right and fitting, and it's something that will be a source of healing. That the little taste you've had of it already has given you a sense of reconnection to yourself. And although this doesn't solve all your problems instantly, it does touch and release some power or presence or harmony within yourself, some grace, some peace, that makes all the difference to the way you deal with your problems. And yet, at the same time that we are attracted to it as a source of healing and wholeness, yet also we find it difficult. We're resistant to it. The interesting thing is that when you teach meditation to children, and you teach it without putting any guilt on them for not meditating, but you just show them how to meditate and meditate with them, give them just a little bit of gentle support, encouragement, particularly I think when they meditate with other children of their own age. That's how they learn. It's almost inevitable that these children will tell you that they like meditation and that they meditate on their own outside the school when nobody's telling them they should meditate. Now, we don't tell them you've got to meditate twice a day, morning and evening, but they choose to meditate when they feel like it. So, we're a little bit more complex. We know that we need discipline. In fact, I think it's a gift. As somebody said to me once recently, I'm so grateful to have found a discipline, a spiritual discipline. We sense, I think, and perhaps it's an important part of the spiritual journey, that we need a discipline in order to make, to reconnect us to this source of wholeness and healing as a presence in our life, not just in extreme crises or difficulties, but, you know, like taking your vitamins every day rather than waiting until you get very sick before you go for treatment. I found an interesting expression or way of maybe understanding this in Freud's idea of neurosis. Perhaps it can help us to understand what's happening in this feeling of division or contradiction that we discover in ourselves when we come to practice a spiritual discipline. And this interior division being itself a symbol or a sign of that deeper primal fault. For Freud, a neurosis is basically a denial of reality. Because we find reality too difficult, too painful, too true, too embarrassing. And just very, very briefly, he has a theory of what he calls the pleasure principle. That this is our first instinct as we grow in consciousness. At a very, very early stage, we seek what is going to give us pleasure. Some simple gratification of our appetite or our need for warmth or security or food or milk or whatever it is. So we seek pleasure, and of course then we discover there are many ways we get pleasure. And what a wonderful place the world is, that it has all these pleasures that we can discover. Pleasures of the senses, and later, I suppose, pleasures of the mind. And but then, at times, we discover that these sources of pleasure don't give us what we think they're going to give us. So we develop the power of attention to scan the world around us, and before we go for the pleasure we think is there in that object or thing, we think about it, and therefore thought is born. We begin to play the scene in our minds. If I do this, will I get that pleasure or not? And therefore thought and attention begin to develop in consciousness as well. So we go from pleasure to thought to attention. And then this is the beginning of what he calls the reality principle. This is where you realize that some things are not going to give you pleasure, or they may not give you pleasure immediately. So you begin, to accept that you may have to wait or you may have to do something else first before you get what you want. Okay? So the reality principle comes in not to suppress the pleasure principle, but almost in a sense to defend it, to keep it functioning. So we have these two principles working in our psyche, that which seeks pleasure, but that which also makes us realistic about it, and would, for example, persuade us to undertake a discipline in order to gain this higher goal, this higher pleasure. So I think we could see in our daily meditation at times these two principles at work. You want to meditate because you know it will give you the higher pleasure of greater wholeness and peace. You know you will feel better after meditation. And yet you're feeling, for one reason or another, restless, agitated, distracted, tired, and you look for excuses not to meditate. And all of this is going on in your own mind. This is entirely up to you. It's a little dialogue or struggle you're having with yourself. Nobody else is involved in this. And then the reality principle would say, okay, well, you should meditate because this will reinforce the discipline of meditation in your life, and you'll feel better not only after the meditation, but it will be strengthening this connection with wholeness and peace within you. And you need to develop this on a daily basis, on a regular basis anyway. I was talking to somebody, listening to somebody recently at a retreat who was, in the question period, was coming up with all sorts of objections to meditation, why it was so difficult and so hard and, such a real struggle, and very, very sort of negative about it. So I said, well, what is your actual practice? What do you do? And he said, oh, I don't. So I said, well, why don't you just meditate once a year, but meditate at the same time every year? So that would be the beginning of a discipline. If you do it just once a year, then after 5 years you could make it maybe twice a year. So the key to this really is regularity. We all function better when we're in a rhythm. We like regular things. We naturally seek out regularity in all eating or living and sleeping and so on. So it's regularity, in a way, building meditation into your life so that it becomes part of your life, that enables you to strengthen the practice in your life over time. So anyway, this is a little way of understanding perhaps why we feel this tension, why we want to do it but we don't do it, and understanding that this is perfectly normal. This is part of the psyche. This is how we operate in many things in life. And in fact, this is exactly what St. Paul describes in the letter to the Romans, when he says, what I want to do, I do not do. And what I don't want to do, that is what I end up doing. Well, that pretty well describes what any person in the 12-step program would recognize as the powerlessness. The flesh is the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. We saw that yesterday. So this is inherent in us. And there's nobody who doesn't experience this weakness arising from a fault. A fault, a crack, a break in us. So this, but then for Paul, it is this very discovery of the crack or the fault or the division within ourselves, the contradiction within ourselves, that opens the window and allows grace to come in. It's like discovering this and accepting this in ourselves is like drawing the curtains in the morning and letting in the sun, the sunlight. And that sunlight is grace. Just letting it in. It's there. And the letting it in is the acceptance, the recognition, and the truthfulness of recognizing it. And this is a kind of saving knowledge. It's a saving knowledge that is very much related to our own weakness. So we come back to that idea that our destiny is this fullness of being, which is nothing less than the fullness of God. And yet we can understand this destiny, this divinization, only through our weakness, only through that crack, that break. And that's where we face the huge power of illusion and self-deception, because when we face or discover our weakness, our imperfection, this interior divisions, we usually deal with it by suppressing it, denying it, certainly hiding it from others, and then covering it over with an illusion of our power. So the ego compensates for this dangerous discovery of our weakness by constructing an image of self which is in control, which is powerful. And it's this image, this false image of self, that is confronted by the story of Easter. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, as we saw yesterday, at his most human. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian who was executed by the Nazis in 1945. And in his last year that he spent alive in prison, he wrote some of the most powerful pieces of Christian writing, theology of our time. And perhaps because of his situation and his awareness that he was going to be executed, rather like Jesus in Gethsemane, he was taken really to the heart of the gospel mystery and to the weakness or the powerlessness of God. God allows himself, he says, God allows himself to be edged out of the world and onto the cross. God is weak and powerless in the world. And that is exactly the way, the only way, in which he can be with us and help us. We don't normally think of God in this way, and it may even seem, blasphemous or absurd for us to do so. We begin all our prayers at Mass, Almighty and Eternal God. Omnipotence, being all-powerful, is how we like our God to be. But in fact, paradoxically, this is not really how we see or connect with God through the story either of our own lives or the story of Easter. I was sort of reminded of this. I was looking at some news from the church this morning, and there was a short story about a bishop somewhere in the world from Amazonia, I think. And he'd been talking. He had a private meeting with the Pope, and he was talking to the Pope about shortage of priests, and must have raised the question of having married priests. And the Pope said, and this expresses the Pope's sort of style of management and his policy, the way he comes to policy. The Pope said, well, discuss this with your other bishops. Very clever, actually. Because he has the power, with the stroke of a pen, to allow for married priests. I have no idea whether he wants it or not, but I would be a guess that he would be open to it. And certainly, he seems to be, but it's a very wise thing, and part of his policy of collegiality, which means his policy of getting the bishops to operate with their own authority, not just as delegates of the hierarchy or of him himself, but to get the bishops to work together, and therefore to make the church a more mature, self-governing institution. That's a big step. No one's been able to do that so far. But what is he doing there? He is allowing himself to be a little powerless. He could have said, yes, okay, we'll have married priests in Amazonia, we'll see if it works there. But he empowers the bishops. Don't quote me on this, but it sounds as if he's doing it. He's empowering the bishops. This is what the story said. And in doing so, he is being rather powerless himself. So it's a little indication of how we might understand the powerlessness of God. And if we look at our own relationships, both our personal relationships as well as our professional relationships, we're very conscious today, as never before, I think, of the need for consultation, the need for discussion, the need to bring people with you when there's a big decision to be made, rather than the old model of authority, where the boss or the father of the family imposed usually his will on everybody else, and everybody else had to conform. So we're moving into an era, a cultural era, where we actually discover that things work better, families work better, corporations work better, when there is this culture of participation. And that the leader is not a tyrant, an omnipotent tyrant, but is somebody who empowers others. And I've met very impressive leaders of corporations who say that they don't do anything. They're paid a big salary, but they don't do anything, and their job is to make themselves as unnecessary as possible. They only step in when things need to be changed or corrected. So anyway, it's a human metaphor for what is a very difficult idea for us, which is the idea of a powerless God. But it's this powerlessness of God that we see reflected throughout the life of Jesus, his association with prostitutes and lepers and low-level people and tax collectors, the sick and the mentally ill. And this was in a culture, and a religious culture, which believed that people who were in favor with God received the good things of life. You were blessed by God with prosperity and health and children and, good things, if you were good. And if you didn't have those things, if you were born with a disability, or you lost everything, or you contracted leprosy, then that was a sign that you or your parents or somebody or other had sinned, lost God's favour, and you were being punished for it. That's still quite common in our psyche as a way of trying to explain why bad things happen to people who don't seem to deserve it. So, quite clearly, Jesus confronts and overturns that idea of a powerful God making other people rich and powerful because he favours them. What we see then is a different kind of power. Certainly nothing of the power that we normally pursue, or politicians, or people wanting financial power or social power. The kind of power that they imagine is certainly not at all similar to this power of the powerlessness of God. It's not the power that controls and forces people to do things, but it's a power that heals, that reconnects and loves. And we don't normally speak about this as a power, we normally speak about it as a gift. If you say that somebody has a healing, has the power to heal, we quite often would say he has a gift for healing. Maybe you might say a power, but normally I think we would say a gift because it expresses something closer to the way it is shared and the way in which it is experienced, not imposed, but it's delivered in a gentle way. Simone Weil, who is a contemporary of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who also died during the last war, was also one of the great Christian prophets and thinkers of our time. And she also, in the middle of the war, developed an understanding and some beautiful philosophy and theology about the powerlessness of God. God, she said, comes back to us again and again like a beggar. This is her image of God that she returns to many, many times. So, she says that God is like a shamefaced beggar. And this is the supreme symbol of God for us to reflect upon. It's through this symbol that we can come closest to contact with that healing power, that healing force, that healing reality of the wholeness that we call God. She says that God limits his infinite power through love. Well, that makes sense. When you love someone, in a way, you limit the power. You cannot love and harm someone willingly at the same time. You can't love and force someone to do something at the same time. And it's because of this self-limitation of God, and this is the key question here, that God limits himself, or in the words of St. Paul, he empties himself, that this is the way that God can share in the suffering of limited and broken human beings. It's by God's self-limiting that he can enter into the human condition. We'll have a look at a passage from the Gospel of John after meditation that might give us some new ways of understanding that. It's an image of God we find difficult to swallow because it's so much of a contradiction of the image of God that we've probably grown up with, and the cultural image of God that surrounds us. But it does seem to be the understanding of God that is communicated through the story that we're listening to in Holy Week. So we'll take a minute or two. We'll have a little music and just let's stay quietly together while